And the Mamaroneck and Larchmont Public Libraries are pleased to welcome you this evening to the program on the new book, Together, an inspiring response to the separate but equal Supreme Court decision that divided America, by Amy Nathan, an award-winning author of books for adults and young people on music, civil rights, women's history, and dance. Joining this evening will be Keith Plessy, and in a few moments, hopefully, Phoebe Ferguson, direct descendants of the principals in the 1896 Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, which ushered in more than 50 years of Jim Crow segregation. Their new Plessy and Ferguson Foundation aims to bring people together, not drive them apart, as a Supreme Court decision did. The book Together intertwines Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson's personal journeys with a compact presentation of the history of the 1896 Supreme Court's case, Plessy versus Ferguson, its disastrous aftermath, and continuing negative impact today. So I'd like to introduce Keith and Amy right now, and Phoebe will be joining us shortly. Please begin.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Jessica, for your kind introduction. And thanks also to the other librarians, Paul Doherty, who's with us tonight, and Linda Mundari, and Lori Friedley, and the Mamaroneck and Larchmont Public Libraries for hosting us this evening. And we're so glad to have Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson with us, and we hope Phoebe manages to sign on soon. We'll hear from both of them in a few minutes, but they're the reason the book exists. Several years ago, I saw a photo of them in an online news story celebrating the creation of their Plessy and Ferguson Foundation to bring people together to learn from the past and help undo some of the damage caused by that 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision that bears their family names, and which, as Jessica said, ushered in more than 50 years of Jim Crow segregation. So I had just finished writing a book on Baltimore civil rights history about people coming together across racial and religious lines to end segregation there. So I was on the lookout for other examples of that. And when I saw that photo of Keith and Phoebe, I decided I had to write about that. They're direct descendants, as Jessica said, of the principals in that court case. So Keith's great-grandfather was a first cousin of Homer Plessy, the black man who was arrested in 1892 in New Orleans for sitting in a train car for white passengers. Phoebe's great-great-grandfather was the judge who ruled against Homer Plessy in New Orleans, causing the case to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was at the Supreme Court that their family names became linked in history. The Supreme Court ruled against Homer Plessy too, giving its stamp of approval to separate but equal, the legal underpinning of Jim Crow, that separating people by skin color was okay if the separate facilities provided for black people were equal to those provided for whites. But of course, as we all know, they were almost never equal. So I thought, if these two families, whose names have been seen as polar opposites in civil rights history for more than 100 years, can work to bring people together, then there's hope for the rest of us. So I contacted them to see if they'd be interested in having a book written about their foundation, and they said, go right ahead. So they and their friends and colleagues have been so helpful with this book. Together, as Jessica says, intertwines their journeys with a compact history of that 1896 court decision and its aftermath. So this book could be a helpful handbook for those, especially for those who are just beginning to immerse themselves in all this history. The work of their foundation and of other groups described in the book may also give ideas for ways that other groups could help bring people together. Plus, half the book's royalties go to help support the work of the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation. So now I'm going to try to screen share and show you a brief, okay, there it is. I'm going to show you a brief PowerPoint on the book. So do you see it? The screen share? Okay, let's see. This is always the hardest part of these programs. There we go. You can see it now. Okay. And then after I show a brief introduction to the book, and then we'll hear from Keith and Phoebe and from your questions too. So the book takes a personal approach to presenting that court case. by telling the story through the eyes and perspectives of Keith and Phoebe, who we meet in chapter 1 as young children. So here they are on the very first page of the book with their second grade school photos. They were both born in 1957 in New Orleans, but they never met as children. In chapter 1, they each describe their first encounters with segregation as young children in New Orleans and the confusion that those experiences caused in both of them. Such as Keith at the park in his local neighborhood. Here, I'm going to try to shut these pictures down on the side so we can see full screen. Okay. At his park in his local neighborhood, he said, "I was never allowed to play there as a child on Saturdays and Sundays. Only white kids could play there on weekends." He also recalled storekeepers who wouldn't wait on him when he went into the store, or he wondered why his school had to have been started by the Black community because the city didn't provide a school for Black children in his neighborhood. He said, "As a child, I was always questioning things when it came to the color of a person's skin, why people who were considered to be white got better treatment than others." So Phoebe first encountered segregation as a child too, when her African-American babysitter tried to take her to the movies one day. The theater, she was about 6 years old at the time, she said. The theater would let Phoebe sit downstairs, but her babysitter had to sit upstairs. So Phoebe said she wasn't going to go to the movies without her babysitter, and they didn't stay to see that movie. "We walked home in total silence," she said, holding hands. "I remember feeling really sad and not understanding." And there was another incident at the carousel at the local city park where Phoebe was able to ride on a horse, but not her babysitter. "It was definitely confusing and not fair," said Phoebe. So at the end of the first chapter, we note that by the time they finally met as adults, they had both learned that a member of their families had met 65 years before they were born, and that 1892 meeting helped explain the rules that troubled them as kids. The next few chapters present the history of how their ancestors met. And we get a few updates here and there from Keith and Phoebe as they recount how they learned about their link to the case. So in chapter 2, we meet Homer Plessy, although there's no photo of Homer Plessy. So instead, I used this photo of a teenager who portrayed Homer Plessy in a play that teenagers created in 2010 about links to their own lives of Homer Plessy's story. Chapter 2 covers a roller coaster ride of emotions. It starts before the Civil War, when free people of color in Louisiana had few rights and enslaved people had none at all. Then it describes the hope-filled period right after the Civil War, when people of color gained new rights from 3 new amendments to the U.S. Constitution, including voting rights for Black men. And so in 1868, Louisiana got an amazing new constitution written by both Black and white delegates that established integrated schools in New Orleans, something that no other southern city had at that time, and not many in the North either. Streetcars and trains were desegregated. Segregation was officially ended in businesses serving the public. But soon those hopes were dashed as white supremacists regained control, aided by Ku Klux Klan-like violence, as in the 1873 massacre at Colfax Courthouse. And Colfax is just north of New Orleans, when armed white group took over the local courthouse to install officials opposed to the rights for Black people. More than 150 people were killed in the Colfax massacre, which is one of the largest massacres during Reconstruction. Or an event that happened in 1874, an event that really came back to my mind on January 6th of this year, as thousands of armed members of another KKK white group called the White League stormed the offices of Louisiana's elected governor, who favored Black rights, and replaced him with a governor who didn't. That takeover ended only when federal troops arrived 3 days later, but by then 11 police officers, both Black and white, had been killed. But 3 years later, a white League candidate did become governor as part of the backroom deal-making in the disputed presidential election of Rutherford B. Hayes. And so, as you may remember, we all heard about that last year, too. So Hayes promised to remove federal troops from the South if electors in Louisiana and other southern states voted for him in the Electoral College. And so they did, and he removed federal troops from the South in 1877, and that marked the end of Reconstruction. White supremacists took charge throughout the South, and in Louisiana, integrated schools stopped right away, and underfunded schools for Black children deteriorated. But what really sparked resistance was in 1890 when the legislature passed the Separate Car Act that segregated trains again. The Black community decided it had to challenge that law to prevent more such laws. And Homer Plessy, age 29, volunteered to be arrested in 1892 to launch a test case against that law. So then chapters 3 and 4 describe the amazing civil rights movement organized by a citizens committee made up of members of New Orleans' Black community to oppose the Separate Car Act. Now, this illustration introduces chapter 3, and it comes from a mural in New Orleans by I.O. Scott. A frame from that mural is also on the book's cover. So in this mural, you'll notice that all the signs in the illustration the words are written backwards. That's reflecting how people of color must have felt in 1890, that history was going backwards, with rights being snatched away. And these two chapters also describe an early example of people working together across racial lines, the strong relationship that developed between Black Creole lawyer Louis Martinet, a leader of the Citizens Committee, and a white lawyer, Albion Tourget, a famous supporter of Black rights, who offered to be the committee's legal advisor for free. They never met, but developed a strong relationship through letters they wrote back and forth, with Martinet in New Orleans and Tourget in upstate New York. And so in the book, I include a few examples of excerpts from their letters, and they really were quite remarkable letters. Now, chapter 5 includes covers the case at the Supreme Court in 1896, with the arguments used by Tourget and the decision by the majority, white justices all, who found the idea of separate but equal perfectly acceptable, except for one justice, Justice John Marshall Harlan, who was also white, and he recognized the injustice of separating people by skin color. And this quote from his eloquent dissent is said to be one of the most quoted comments by any Supreme Court justice. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In the respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. There was also stirring quotes that came out of that case, despite Homer Plessy losing, that came from the Citizens Committee in the final report they wrote about their efforts. In it, they said, "We, as free men, still believe that we were right and our cause is sacred." And one of the members of the committee, Rodolphe Dedune, said, "We think it is more noble and dignified to fight, no matter what, than to show a passive attitude of resignation." Well, the next chapter describes the spread of Jim Crow that followed Plessy versus Ferguson. In addition to segregated seating and streetcars, that's what you see in the lower photo here, they had something called the race screen. It was a movable wooden block that could be moved and put on the top of any seat. White people could move it any way they wanted, and Black people could only sit behind where the screen was. Or even in doctors' offices, you'll see there's a separate entrance for Black people. But there were many other regulations of the Jim Crow era that reached into nearly all aspects of life in New Orleans. And new Jim Crow policies have had a long-lasting impact, such as new voting rules in 1898 that made it nearly impossible for Black men to vote, with a tricky, impossible-to-pass reading test that applied only to Black men. And of course, no women were voting then at all. These rules were very effective. Before 1898, nearly half of Louisiana voters were Black. By 1910, less than 1% were. Underfunding of schools for Black students also had long-lasting consequences. as did neighborhood segregation policies and federal redlining rules that made it very hard for Black families to become homeowners and build familial wealth, and also made it hard to move out of neighborhoods near sources of industrial air pollution that negatively impacts health, which we have seen play out this past 2 years in the disproportionate impact of COVID on minority communities. So Jim Crow's reach was very wide and has been very long-lasting. Now, Chapter 7 describes the official end of Jim Crow, helped in New Orleans by lawsuits filed by its lead NAACP lawyer, A.P. Turow. He filed lawsuits that chipped away at aspects of Jim Crow bit by bit. He also encouraged Black citizens to try to vote despite the restrictions. 1950s and 60s protesters helped too, as did the federal civil rights laws of the 1960s, combined with the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision that officially overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, with the court unanimously saying that separate but equal had no place in public education. But despite those laws, the Jim Crow way of thinking, as we all have seen in the past couple of years, has a way of lingering on. Because, for example, despite the eloquence of the Brown decision, in many parts of the United States, including New Orleans and also New York City, many schools are as segregated now as they were in pre-Brown days. But Chapter 7 also describes positive gains, with Black officials now holding office in New Orleans and Louisiana. Confederate statues came down there in 2017, and streets named for slaveholders are now getting new names. The final chapters of the book describe the Plessy versus Ferguson and Ferguson Foundation. But we have been hearing from Keith and Phoebe during the history chapters as they both talk about how they first heard about the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And for both of them, that happened in 5th grade. For Keith, his 5th grade teacher noted that his last name was Plessy, and so he probably was related to Homer Plessy, but they didn't know how. And Keith said all we had in that history book in school was that he refused to get out of his seat. It didn't go into that it was actually a civil rights movement that was going on at that time. But he admits that I didn't take it by the horns and find out everything about Homer Plessy. I hated history, he said. Every time the subject of history came up in class, I would draw pictures. Well, that was partly because he liked to draw, and he later went to art school. But it was also because he just didn't feel that the history he was learning in school had any connection to him personally. He finally learned about his connection to the case in 1996, when he was contacted by Keith Weldon Medley, who was working on a book on the Plessy case called We as Free Men. And it was from Keith Weldon Medley that Keith Plessy learned that his great-grandfather was Homer Plessy's cousin. Medley also told him all about what the Citizens Committee had tried to do. And Keith's attitude toward history totally changed. He now is a fan of history. And so here you can see that same year he went to the 100th anniversary celebration of the Plessy decision that was held in New Orleans. And there he is with his wife and his 2 daughters, his father, and one of his cousins. He also learned from Medley about cousins that he never knew he had. And some of these cousins have been doing a lot of genealogical research, and he found out that his great-great-great-great-grandmother had been enslaved and gained her freedom thanks to a white Frenchman who served in the American Revolutionary War and paid off her enslaver. So as he says now, I can't forget anything I hear about history. It has become part of me. So Phoebe first heard of the case in 5th grade also. By then she was living in California, where she and her mother moved after her father died. And so she says she heard about the case and she thought, well, gee, I'm from New Orleans and I have that last name. But she didn't bother to pursue it further. Just like Keith, she was more interested in art than in learning about history. She later went to art school and became a professional photographer. But she said nobody at home talked about it. Nobody mentioned to her. It wasn't in her father's obituary in the newspaper that he was related to the judge in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Nobody in her family ever mentioned that. She didn't learn it until 2002 when she got a surprise phone call in New York from someone who was buying Judge Ferguson's old house in New Orleans and was contacting anyone he could find named Ferguson. She had just received an envelope from her sister with some family history in it, but she hadn't opened it yet. So right there on the phone, she opened the envelope, and there, sure enough, Judge Ferguson was her great-grandfather. She traveled to New Orleans to try to learn more because she said that a part of my family helped start Jim Crow is kind of a load to carry. She searched in archives to try to figure out why he did what he did. And then she heard about Keith Weldon Medley's book. She contacted him and he invited her to come to a book signing. And it was at that book signing in 2004 where he introduced Keith Plessy to Phoebe Ferguson. Now, Phoebe was so embarrassed meeting someone named Plessy that she tried to apologize for what her ancestor had done. Keith laughed and said, "You weren't alive during that time. I wasn't either. It's time for us to change that whole narrative." And so he invited her to come to lunch with his family the next day. They became friends. And that really surprised people they knew. How could a Plessy possibly be friends with a Ferguson? But others saw that their families getting along was a powerful symbol of a kind of national reconciliation. And so they and their family and friends decided to build on that symbolism by starting the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation in 2009. This is a statement of principle committed to teaching the history of the landmark case Plessy versus Ferguson, its historic impact on African Americans, and how we can learn from the past to create a more just and equitable future. So this is their very first action, which was to install a very detailed historical marker. And the historical markers that they write are just full of details on both sides of the marker. It's interesting, they were both trained as visual artists, and so they chose a visual way to help people learn history that will help them undo some of the damage from the past. So far, they have installed 5 markers, and they also hold events every June 7th, which is Plessy Day. That's the date in 1892 when Homer Plessy was arrested. It's an official day of observance in Louisiana, but I'm thinking that it might be something that the other groups that are interested in anti-racism work might want to celebrate too, combining it with Juneteenth celebrations, because Juneteenth is all about gaining freedom, but Plessy Day is a reminder of how easily freedom can be snatched away. So it might be something for other groups to consider doing. At this 2010 Plessy Day, teenagers put on the play that I told you about earlier about Homer Plessy's story's connection to them, to their own lives. It was a play that they improvised and created themselves. Other events that the foundation has put on are presentations with legal and academic experts, musical performances, a mock trial, and they participated in panel discussion with descendants of other civil rights cases. And they have a big event planned for May 18th, which will be the 125th anniversary of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which was announced on May 18th, 1896. And here's their first flyer. It's going to be possible to sign up on Facebook Live, and they'll have more information on their website about how to sign up for us. And they have a whole day's worth of activities, afternoons for teachers and students, in the evening with legal experts. And also they're going to have a panel discussion with other descendants of famous civil rights cases, including the Dred Scott case and Brown versus Board of Education. And a special guest they're going to have there of 2 great, or maybe it's 3 greats, I don't know, granddaughters of Justice John Marshall Harlan. So the book, also in the afterword of the book, I describe some other groups that are also trying to bring people together. And like the Equal Justice Initiative and other groups like that. But there's a brand new organization that just started this year in New Orleans called the TEP Interpretive Center. It's housed at the old school building where New Orleans made its very first attempt at desegregating its schools in 1960, many years after the 1954 decision, but they delayed as long as they could. And in 1960, they only desegregated it with 4 6-year-old girls. Leona Tate, Gail Etienne, and Tessie Prevost desegregated one school, and Ruby Bridges desegregated another. So in 2010, the Plessy Ferguson Foundation and Leona Tate's foundation installed a historical marker at the school. She and Gail Etienne and Tessie Prevost desegregated 50 days earlier. And here they are at the installation ceremony. And the man on the far left and the 2 men on the far right were the federal marshals who had to escort them to and from school in 1960 to protect them from angry white mobs. Now, that building is no longer used as a school, and last year the Leona Tate Foundation raised funds to buy it and turn it into a community center, the TEP Interpretive Center. The name uses the initials of the 3 women's last names, and it will include a museum, low-income housing for seniors, and it will also offer anti-racism workshops. So I'm going to stop the PowerPoint now so we have time to hear from Keith and Phoebe, and then we can hear questions from you. And here are links that you might find helpful. There is a teacher's guide and also a discussion guide for the book that are available on the publisher's website. And so that's a link to that. And there's the Phoebe and Ferguson Foundation website, and there's my website. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Now I'm going to stop screen sharing, and Keith can unmute. Did Phoebe arrive? Is Phoebe here?
Okay, am I unmuted? No, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was saying, unfortunately, I don't see, unless she's using someone else's Zoom with another link, she wasn't able to join.
Oh,
so
okay.
I apologize for that.
Okay, well, I hope maybe she'll figure out how to join later. But Keith is here, and so I thought I could ask a couple of questions of Keith. Tell us more about why you and Phoebe chose to start the foundation, and why you decided on historical markers as one of the foundation's main projects.
Well, thank you, Amy. I would like to thank everyone for joining in tonight and for having me on this program. I'm very grateful for that. And to answer your question, Amy, it was people around us that influenced us more than we did ourselves. We were intent on being friends, and that was our intention from the beginning. And we were going to be friends for life as far as we were concerned, between Phoebe and I. But around us were Author Keith Weldon Medley, who wrote that book that brought us together at that book signing. And Keith, actually, the Marker Project was born by Keith Weldon Medley. He was dreaming of doing this for a long time. And when we finally formed the foundation, he was able to implement his research and place the detailed information that Amy was talking about earlier on those markers. So in the process of us getting those markers done, we had a great author to write the history and do the research. And Keith Weldon Medley was very influential for both of us forming the foundation. On the other hand, there was a gentleman by the name of A.P. Turo Jr. That's the son of A.P. Turo, the great lawyer that fought after the Citizens Committee failed in U.S. Supreme Court in 1896. He was a young child around that time, and he eventually went to Howard University, graduated before Thurgood Marshall, and he worked with Thurgood Marshall on several cases during the 20th century. He was probably a voice in Thurgood Marshall's ear a lot of times when Thurgood Marshall would make decisions on how to go about filing those cases that he won. Also, there was Pastor Brenda Square, and I'll say her full name, Pastor Brenda Billups Square, who is the pastor of Beecher Memorial United Church of Christ in New Orleans, which is a church that was around the corner from the elementary school where I went as a child. Brenda was very influential also in talking us into forming a foundation because they knew the impact of it well, I would say more than Phoebe and I actually were feeling that. But eventually we all came to an agreement, and we had met in 2004, and about 5 years later in 2009, we formed the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation. And matter of fact, that was on the date of the argument that was in the court for Plessy v. Ferguson and Brown v. Board, the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was adopted to the U.S. Constitution on July 9th, 1868, and we formed the foundation on July 9th, 2009.
So what kind of response have you had from the community, from the markers that go up? So the response for the marker at the school where Leona Tate went was very strong. But have you had community support from some of the other markers too?
Yes. Each marker has an individual impact, but I would say that the one mentioned for Gail, Leona, and Tessie was the most impact. Each community, with the first one, with Plessy v. Ferguson, there are several tours that pass through that area. And we get a lot of feedback from people that call us about the marker. And now the street has been changed from Press and Royal Street to Homer Plessy Way and Royal Street. Press Street actually is what defines the cotton press that was located at the train station, combination train station cotton press, where Homer Plessy was arrested in 1892. And we changed that name in 2018. We had that name changed to Homer Plessy Way. Now the other markers, Jones School, the school that I attended in elementary years that taught me that I was related to Homer Plessy, we had that marker put up in 2015. And we are looking at possibly bringing that one to a point where it might resemble the development that took place in 2010 for the TEP Center. Jones School sits in the middle of the 7th Ward, and Beecher Memorial United Church of Christ sits around the corner from Jones School. And Brenda Billups Square, Pastor Brenda Billups Square, has the original paperwork that was from the owners of the property that the school was built on. They made a deal with the school board back in, I think it was about 1926, when the school was completely built, that there would not be any property built on that land unless it was a school for Black children. And the school board agreed, and they built the school there. So what we're trying to do now is take that history and impact it from the marker we put there in 2015 and see how far we can go about bringing that place back to life to serve the community again.
In the chat, and it sounds like Phoebe is here. Phoebe is here under Paul's name. Phoebe, are you there? Can you unmute?
I am finally here.
Yay, yay, yeah. And can you show video? Oh, there she is. Okay, great. We're really glad you made it. Good. So, so yes, the question that I asked Keith, probably before you signed on, was, why you all formed the foundation. So he answered that, but I was just wondering, why is it important to share the stories that you are sharing in those markers? What is it that you hope people will gain from reading those stories?
Oh my goodness. You really have to have this experience where you are at the marker and you are watching other people come by and stop and read the marker to understand its true impact. Now, I joined you all on through a browser so that I could get on. But there's this wonderful picture that I posted online last night, Amy. I happened to be there taking the picture for you for the book at the Pythian Temple marker. And this woman came, I turned around and there was a woman reading the marker. And I have to say, it was so fabulous because she was wearing this skirt and she was in high heel, just beautifully dressed out of the 1950s. That's all I can say. It was just absolutely spectacular. And she was engrossed in reading the history of the Pythian Temple. And I think that, I mean, of course you can't say everything. In many ways, you're so limited. So the work of writing the markers is really to, when you're doing the research, you have to filter and take the most important information that you feel and your community members or your team, feel that is going to tell the story and encourage people to go research more. And that's a fun process, It's a team effort with your whoever you partner with. And it takes several months because everybody has a different feeling about what's important to put in the marker, right? So it's a process, but I have to say that I think it was that marker that we put up in 2017, where I remember this crowd came out. You never know who's going to come. That's the other thing. You just, put out the announcements, the press releases, and you hope for the best. And then this crowd shows up, and they are so excited. I remember walking across the street after the marker ceremony and the unveiling over to the Pythian Temple, which the marker was about, to have a celebration. And I turned to someone and I said, who knew that putting up historical markers could make you feel like a rock star?
Well, the Pythian Temple is a really interesting story. This was a man who had been enslaved, and he started a grocery store business after he gained his freedom, and then figured out that since insurance companies wouldn't sell insurance policies to Black people, he would. And so he made a fortune selling insurance to the Black community. And then there was this organization called the Order of the Knights of the Pythia that was started in 1864. It was supposed to try to bring America together after the Civil War. But then in the southern states, the white members of the Pythian wouldn't allow the Black members of the Pythian to join. So there went that idea of bringing people together, right? So they started Black Orders of the Pythian, and he became the head of the branch of the Pythian order in Louisiana, and had the best architect in New Orleans design this building. And even the white-owned Times-Picayune newspaper said this was one of the best examples of architecture. At that time, it was like 1919 or something like that it was built. It was a long time ago. And so it was and it became like a community center. They had a nightclub, they had restaurants, a rooftop restaurant, and
best music.
And all the jazz musicians came there. And so it was a place where Black people could go and be just themselves. And when they walked out of the building, they would have to again be treated in the Jim Crow manner, but inside that building. Yeah.
Amy, I have a fun fact for you.
Yeah.
You clearly know a lot about the Knights of Pythias and how it got started, but when we were doing the research, we found out that in the process, when they were trying to become, join the White Knights of Pythias, and they were told that they could not, they wanted to then use all of the branding and iconography. And they said no. So they sued in court to be able to use the same Knights of Pythias branding, because they were going to be black, but they were still the organization. So guess who ruled in their favor?
Judge Ferguson?
No. Judge Edward White, who sat as an associate justice on Plessy v. Ferguson and voted against Plessy, ruled in their favor for them to be able to use the white emblems of the Knights of Pythias. Just fun fact.
Yeah,
I got two others. A.P. Turo met his wife to be, at the Pythian, at the Pythian Temple of that time, at the rooftop garden concert. He met Miss Dejois, his wife to be, on that property, and Homer Plessy was an employee of Smith Wendell Green, the gentleman you spoke of, who started the Pythian Temple in New Orleans. After the Industrial Revolution took Homer Plessy's job as a shoemaker, because shoes were being pumped out in numbers, and shoemakers were not looked upon as a person you want to go get your shoes from if you can go get them fast and like the manufacturers were making them. And when he went out of business as a shoemaker, he sought a job as an insurance salesman for Smith Wendell Green.
Right.
Yeah.
and then the Great Depression and World War II, and they lost control of the building itself. And then people covered it with some sort of terrible aluminum siding that covered over all the beautiful architectural details of the building. And so a few years ago, a developer bought the building and restored it to its former glory. And so that's why the marker was put up there to tell the story, and then to let people know. Now it's an apartment building, right? It's a probably like a multi-use building, yeah. So and so he wrote a very moving, the man who was the head of the real estate company wrote a very moving comment about that's included in the book, where he said, as a white wealthy white Southerner, his generation, the generations before him, not only kept blacks from having prosperity, but also covered their stories and hid their stories. And so that's why he was so excited to join with you to make the Pythian Temple marker, because now the stories could be told. So, but I was wondering a more practical kind of question, because you probably had never formed a nonprofit or organized foundation before. And what gave you the courage to do that? And what have you learned about doing that might help other people who might consider forming an anti-racist foundation? What advice would you give them?
Hold on tight. Well, first, courage is an interesting word, because I think had it been any other kind of reason, any other nonprofit other than this one, I don't know that I would have had the courage to, take it on in terms of all of its administrative duties and fundraising and all of that, because it's not in my training, it's not in Keith's training. And I think it was more that we both felt that we had a legacy that could, only if we used it together could it act as a be symbolic in terms of reconciliation and changing people's minds about reconciliation and what is possible. And we saw people's reaction to us being friends, and it really blew us away. And so it was like we could not walk away from this. even if we wanted to, we couldn't.
Mm.
And, you know, I would say that we are not perhaps the best at running a nonprofit, but we do the best we can. I would say, you know, retrospect, definitely get experience, definitely go. I mean, I've done a lot of workshops with the Greater New Orleans Foundation on executive directorship and, you know, that kind of thing. And, but, you know, you've got to get enough money to have a staff. And that's the kicker right there. And you need a staff to raise a lot of money. So yeah, if you get over that hurdle, God bless you.
Well, I can say something too, Amy, that you said earlier that our new foundation will be working to encourage people to come together. Well, that new foundation is 11 years old now. And to just say, we just, you know, I think George Benson said it as a performer. You know, they said he was an overnight success when he did On Broadway, but he was in the business for 25 years before that song made gold. But I guess you can say, to add to what Phoebe said, is that, you know, if your heart is in it and you know it's the right thing to do, then you seek people that have the same enthusiasm, the same feeling in their hearts, and try to seek some help from people who are more experienced. And like you said, Phoebe, you need to talk to a financial person. You need to talk to a person that handles law, covers the law, and you need to have somebody that pretty much does public relations. We were pretty much thrown into the fire, I would say, in 2009. We were invited to the National Park Service National Historic Site in Little Rock in September of the year we formed the foundation. And it was an eye-opening experience for us. And the National Park Service embraced us at that moment. You know, what I would say too, in the Constitution, if it's something that's constitutionally right that you represent for your foundation and you're trying to form it, you know, the National Constitution Center is one of the places that's going to be assisting us on May 18th. And that's some people that you should be able to contact. You should contact them and find out what services they offer to bring you into a type of organization that might represent what we do.
Right. So you have quite a plan, a program planned for May 18th. So you're having some legal experts talking, but you're also going to have a panel discussion with descendants of other cases. Now, you've met with these descendants several times, and so these are members of the Brown family from Brown versus Board of Education, and also Lynn Jackson, who is the great-great-granddaughter of Dred Scott and has created a foundation, the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation. And she has also reached out, just as Keith and Phoebe have. She reached out and has made a connection with the Taney family. Roger Taney was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who wrote the Dred Scott decision, the decision which basically denied the humanity of people of color. And so that's if the Dred Scott family and the Taney family can work together, you know, that's pretty amazing. So what has it been like to have these discussions with these other descendants? What have you all learned from that? And what
glad
do you
brought that up? Glad you brought it up, because it was almost, to me, and I don't know if it felt the same to Phoebe. You could say it afterwards, Phoebe. I'm just going to mention how it felt to me to meet both those members of those families. And it was almost, to me, as instant as I knew I was a friend of Phoebe's. When I met her, it was automatic. It just wasn't a second thought in my mind that we were not gonna be friends, or we definitely were gonna be friends. When I met her, I knew that I met a genuine person. And I felt the same when I met Cheryl Brown Henderson, because we went to Topeka, Kansas in that January of 2010, second year that we were in existence. And we met the Brown family, and it was a beautiful experience, and we've been friends ever since. And when we met Lynn, it was even more impact. It was just, we knew that we eventually were going to do something like we're going to do on May 18th this year, where we combine our efforts and speak together, because we've done it in St. Louis at Lynn's organization. She has this thing called Sons and Daughters of Reconciliation, and we joined them for a meeting in St. Louis, and Cheryl was there as well. Cheryl Brown Henderson was there too, and we had a great time. When we get together, good things happen, and I would say that it's long overdue that we form a coalition amongst the three cases: the Dred Scott, Sanford, Plessy v. Ferguson, and Brown v. Board.
Right. So then they're going to show excerpts at your event on May 18th from a program called Toward a More or Less Perfect Union. It was a PBS series on the Constitution. They're going to show excerpts from that show of the three cases: Dred Scott, Plessy, and Brown.
And we also have some Lanyap descendants.
Huh?
Lanyap, is an old Cajun word for something, little something extra.
Uh-huh.
And we're having the descendants from John Marshall Harlan join us, whom we've never actually met. So, but we've always been curious. We've always wanted to know if they were descendants. And in the process of putting the program together, it was the folks from a more or less perfect union that said, "Oh, by the way, have you invited the Harlan descendants?" At which point I was like, "Oh my God, there are Harlan descendants." Well, she had just met them also. So they're not, the difference between them and the three of us is that we have made it our life work to teaching, sharing, and the cases are our life work. We've made foundations around them. The two Harlan great-great-granddaughters, one is the editor of the Christian Science Monitor, and the other is, I think, an internationally known cellist. But they were very, at first a little shy about joining, and then decided that it would be a good idea.
Oh, good.
And so, I think that under the umbrella of coming together, that part of the program is going to be a lot about, I think, Amy, kind of what you're asking us now, about, what can we do with this history? Why are we doing it? How is it going to help the next generation fight these battles? More than dissecting the cases, but we never know. Alana Odoms from the ACLU is going to be facilitating that meeting, so who knows what could happen.
Right. And you'll have Judge Ginsburg is going to be there too, and the former Chief Justice of the Louisiana Supreme Court.
She's powerful. She is, the nice thing about that is this is the 125th anniversary. She spoke at the first day we announced the foundation and unveiled the plaque. She was the guest speaker for that too. And we haven't, had her in between, but now she's retired and she's agreed to do this one little thing to come and talk about the cases of the 14th Amendment.
So does anyone want to, if any of the people who've signed on, do they have any questions that they want to ask Keith or Phoebe, or any questions about the case, or, please, put them in the chat, or Paul could arrange it so that people can unmute themselves and just ask the question. I think